class. So this week we're finishing up with part 4, Discrimination in Everyday Life. We're going to start off with race, disability, and the school to prison pipeline. Has anyone heard this term before? Well, the school to prison pipeline is the nebulous mix of forces that join with harsh school discipline policies to drive striking numbers of students of color away from school and into the criminal justice system. So during the 2011 school year, more than 3 million public school students were suspended and over 100,000 were expelled. These students were overwhelmingly black students, and according to the Department of Education, black students are suspended and expelled at 3 times the rate of white students. Also, just one of these suspensions can double the likelihood that students will drop out of school and increase the likelihood that students end up in prison. Also, a disproportionate number of students of color are even arrested at school as a form of punishment. Disability diagnosis also plays an important role in the pipeline in what's called soft disabilities, such as emotional disabilities, behavioral disturbance, or the broad term specific learning disabilities, which usually comes after students arrive in the classroom. So these assessments and labeling processes here are more subjective than medically diagnosed disabilities. For example, white students are more likely to be labeled autistic than students of color, while African American students are at the highest risk of all races for being labeled with the broad term specific learning disabilities. So in 2011 to 2012 school year, black students were twice as likely as Latinos and 4 times as likely as Asians and 1.4 times as likely as whites to receive special education services for emotional disturbance, according to federal data. And going back to the previous slide, once students are labeled as special education, they're placed on accelerated path toward the school to prison pipeline. And students designated as having these disabilities are 2 times as likely as their peers to be punished with suspensions or being expelled. So research also shows that even one suspension in 9th grade doubles the likelihood that students will drop out eventually. Also, the pipeline is much more rootless if the student who's been labeled as disabled also happens to be African American boy. More than 1 in every 4 black boys identified as having a disability was suspended in that 2011 to 2012 school year, according to the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. So the same can be said for American Indian, Pacific Islander, and multiracial boys classified with disabilities. So meanwhile, 12% of white boys classified with disabilities and 10% of Asian boys were suspended. So having been over-identified as disabled and far disproportionately suspended from school, black students are also subjected to some of the highest rates of school-based arrests, which is the final step along the school to prison pipeline. All right, so moving on to the segregated classrooms of a proudly diverse school. So Columbia High School, how many of you are familiar with Columbia High School? Well, it's a great school, great sports team, great academics, famous alumni, and impressive campus. But they have some drawbacks. So though the school is majority black, white students make up the bulk of advanced classes. So while black students far outnumber whites in lower level classes, Oh, I'm sorry. So the school is majority black, but white students make up the bulk of the advanced classes, while the black students um, far outnumber or greater in numbers when it comes to the lower level classes. So educators are saying that leveling allows smarter students to be challenged while giving struggling ones the special instruction they need. But a lot of students, especially those in the lower levels, which often carry a stigma, say that such levels make the rocky adolescent years only harder. So at Columbia High, there is no dispute that it is precisely the leveling system that has led to racial segregation. Research shows that out of the 2024 students, 58% were black, 35% were white, 4% Hispanic, and 3% Asian. And the public school sends more than 90% of graduates to college. It has a dropout rate of less than 0.5%, and it won a National Blue Ribbon Award from the federal government for its academic excellence during the 1992-1993 school year. So as we can see, has it has done great things, but there is a gap. The school is about 15 minutes from downtown New York, and it has, students who live in $1 million homes and students who rely on government lunches. So there is a gap in terms of the demographics. There is a gap in terms of racial diversity in the upper level classes. And so there needs to be ways to narrow those achievement gaps. So some of the suggestions were to, I guess the student leaders and administrators were discussing ways to narrow that gap. So they came up with granting students more say-so in which level they are in, better identifying which level students belong in, expanding a summer school program for students who want to take upper level classes. So they're working on narrowing that gap and allowing students to be more involved in deciding, whether they want to be upper level classes versus lower level classes, or even having better tools or better methods in terms of determining which level students need to be in based on, the stage they're in. All right, so race and family income of students influence guidance counselors' advice. So why do you think that the race and family income of students would have an effect on what those counselors would advise those students? So interesting, a study showed that counselors were more likely to recommend community colleges to middle class black students with subpar academic records than to middle class white students with similar records. The study also showed that among the wealthier students with poor academic records, counselors were more likely to urge white students than black students to attend community colleges. And counselors were more likely to recommend community colleges to middle class students than to wealthier ones. And they recommended the 4-year colleges more strongly to upper class students than to middle class students. So these findings were all based on this three-year study that was sponsored by the National Commission for Cooperative Education. So this study sends out surveys to about 20,000 high school counselors throughout the nation. So it's just interesting that race and family income influence these counselors' decisions on how to advise students and as to what school to go to. All right, so sex crimes on campus. Sexual assault is a serious issue that happens in increasing or is increasing across college campuses. So about 25 to or 20 to 25% of college women experienced rape or attempted rape. I guess according to the sexual victimization of college women, their department report came out with those numbers and also showed that about 1 in 3 gay men, 1 in 5 bisexual men, and 1 in 10 heterosexual men reported experiencing unwanted sexual contact during their lifetime as well. So nearly 10% of women at historically black colleges and universities reported in the fall 2008 historically black college and university campus sexual assault study of the 3,951 undergraduates being a victim of a completed sexual assault since starting college. Incapacitated sexual assault was slightly more prevalent, which it was about 6.2%. It was a little bit more than forced sexual assault, which was only 4.8%. I guess not that much of a difference, but it was slightly higher. So basically with the incapacitated sexual assault is usually like, the victim was probably intoxicated, and so they weren't able to consent or really weren't aware of really what was going on. About 80 to 90% of sexual assaults at colleges involve people that know each other. So the 2005 report, Sexual Assault on Campus, report showed that the more intimate the relationship, the more likely it is for rape to be completed rather than just attempted. So the more intimate the relationship is between those two people, the more likely that rape will happen rather than just it being attempted. And the worst part about it is that half of all those student victims do not label it as rape. This is particularly true when no weapon was used or no sign of physical injury was evident, or if alcohol was involved. So these are all factors that are usually related to campus acquaintance rape. So if no weapon was used, if it wasn't, they weren't physically hurt and there was alcohol involved, usually the victims won't really report it as rape. This is generally because, I guess another factor too is that they knew that person. So another study, the 20-year-old study, showed that 1 in 16 college men said that they had used physical force to have sexual intercourse or had sex with someone who was too incapacitated by alcohol or drugs to resist. So basically, 1 in 16 college men, they basically said that they've used physical force to have sex with someone who basically could not stop them, or someone who could not say no because they were on alcohol or drugs. And I'm not sure if you guys are aware of this or not, but it is illegal to have sex with someone who's intoxicated because they can't consent. So even if they said yes, even if they had said yes, it's illegal because they're not capable of giving consent if they're intoxicated. And then only 10 to 25% of male college rapists were expelled. So even looking at data from 130 colleges and universities, it showed that usually men who are responsible for sexual assault are rarely even expelled. And then if they're not expelled, what do you think that's doing for their victims? Do you think victims are gonna wanna report anything? Probably not, right? Because it's like, they're putting themselves out there, and then in the end, the perpetrator does not get punished. And so that's not helping the victim's self-confidence or even wanting to come forward with that information. All right, students who live in sorority houses are more likely to be raped than off-campus students. So, I guess the study also showed that women who live in sorority houses were 3 times as likely to be raped compared to students who live off-campus. And those that lived in dorms on campus were 1.4 times more likely to be raped than those who lived off-campus. Again, about 84% said that they were sexually coerced during freshman year or sophomore year. A 2004 report in the Journal of Studies of Alcohol showed that 72% of college rape victims were so intoxicated that they could not consent to sex. The study found that students who were under 21, were white, used illegal drugs, drank heavily in high school, and even went to college with high rates of heavy episodic drinking, also face higher risk of rape while intoxicated. Again, we kind of just talked about how people who are intoxicated are not able to give consent. So even if they said yes, that does not count. More than a third of college rapes happen on campus. So the 2002 Justice Department report showed that 34% of completed rapes and 45% of attempted rapes occur on college campuses. So basically, 45% of those attempted rapes, so basically someone attempted or tried to sexually assault someone, but it did not, they got caught or something happened, it didn't happen. 45% of those happen on a college campus. And that was it 34% actually do happen. So almost around 31% of rapes happen in a residence other than the victims. 10% occur in the fraternity house. So about 3 in 5 completed campus rapes happen where the victim lives, but 31% happens somewhere other than where they live. Fewer than 1 in 20 completed and attempted rapes against college students are reported. So less than 5% of completed and attempted rapes are reported to law enforcement or campus officials. So people don't really report these things. So it's really underreported. 40% of rape victims who didn't report their attacks said that they feared, reprisal from the attacker or other people. So the victims are afraid to tell. And of the 2/3 of rape incidents in which victims does tell another person, it's usually a friend. It's usually not a college official or a family member. All right, so moving on to more blacks live with pollution. So according to the Associated Press analysis, Black Americans are 79% more likely than whites to live in neighborhoods where industrial pollution is suspected or posing the greatest health danger. In 19 states, blacks were more likely, or more than twice as likely as whites, to live in neighborhoods where air pollution seems to pose the greatest health danger. More than half the blacks in Kansas and nearly half of Missouri black population, for example, live in the 10% of their state's neighborhoods with the highest risk scores. Also, more than out of every 10 blacks in Kentucky, Minnesota, Oregon, and Wisconsin live in high-risk neighborhoods. So while Hispanics and Asians aren't represented in high-risk neighborhoods nationally, in certain states they are. So in Michigan, for example, 8.3% of the people living in high-risk areas are Hispanic, though Hispanics make up about 3.3% of the statewide population. There are 12 states where Hispanics were more than twice as likely as non-Hispanics to live in neighborhoods with the highest risk scores. There were 7 states. Yeah, there were 7 states where Asians were more than twice as likely as whites to live in the most populated areas, as well. So residents in neighborhoods with the highest population scores also tend to be poorer, less educated, and more often unemployed by those elsewhere in the country. And the average income in the highest risk neighborhoods was 18,806 when the census last measured it, and more than 3,000 less than the nationwide average. So 1 of every 6 people in the highest or in the high risk areas live in poverty, compared with 1 of 8 elsewhere. And also, unemployment was nearly 20% higher than the national average in the neighborhoods with the highest risk. All right, so the next section focuses on Native Americans. And so, according to the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, there are 565 recognized Native American tribes. About 5.2 million people identified themselves as Native Americans or Alaska Native in the 2010 U.S. Census. The Native Americans are even more vulnerable than any other disadvantaged groups because of their reliance on natural resources for survival. The top environmental justice issues are still plaguing their communities, and these are lack of healthy foods, water, and protection of sacred sites. The Native Americans reservations has also been targeted as places to dump industrial waste and to mine both uranium and coal, leading to polluted rivers, lakes, and tribal lands across the country. Some tribes have turned to waste storage or mining as revenue generators. I guess, it's like, why not benefit out of this? How can we turn this into, some form of benefit to us? Native Americans continue to battle poverty, joblessness, and low income. About 28.4% of American Indians and Alaska Natives, and nearly twice the national rate, lived in poverty in 2010.